Okay, good morning, friends, and welcome to this session on SDG 8 and SDG 11 vis-a-vis our Children's Parliament. I had the experience, it is 25 years now, since I had the fortune of associating with Father Edwin to found the first neighborhood community network, experiment with it in one of the slums in Hyderabad. I have been working in slums for the last 30 years. I lived in a slum for 12 years, and we have started many movements. And one of it is how to neighborhoodize people. We run two trade unions, the Domestic Workers Union of the Telangana state, what we call GUTS, that is organized on the principles of the Neighborhood Community Network. We have the Hyderabad Slum People's Federation, which is again organized on the principles of Neighborhood Community Network. We have the Hyderabad City Children's Parliament. We have the Vijayawada City Children's Parliament. And until the COVID lockdown, we had the opportunity of working with the government of Maharashtra Tribal Development Department to start children's parliaments in 60 tribal development residential schools. I see Sister Clara here, who was coordinating that program in Maharashtra. In other words, this is something that the principles of neighborhood community as an alternative to governance processes that we are used to, and how children can be involved, children at the grassroots, children in the neighborhood can be involved in governance processes is something that has been very important experience and learning for me over the last 25 years. And I'm so happy to be meeting all of you who are participating in this webinar. I shall talk to you on two very important SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 8 and SDG 11. And in that context, what the experience of our children in children's parliaments has been, because we work in slums, and when we work in slums, there are very special situations, very special requirements, very special experiences that children experience, and how children make rights, possibilities possible. Let me, to begin with, in fact, one of the very interesting things that we have done with the SDGs with children in Hyderabad City Children's Parliament and also the Vijayawada City Children's Parliament is to take each of the SDGs for children to discuss and children to pass resolutions. So we have, this year we have not had the Children's Assembly and Children's Parliament in Hyderabad and in Vijayawada because of the COVID situation. Normally we used to organize it in November, December. The schools are not reopened. It has not been possible. But every year we have been taking an SDG. We took SDG number 4, quality education, health, work, so-called SDG 8, SDG 11. And in each, at the end of each of these parliaments, what the children have done is to put down, okay, this is how we visualize, we see the world, and this is what we want the governments in power to do. For instance, last year we took SDG 11 for our city level parliament, And they came up with, you are aware, in Vijayawada there is a new capital that is being built called Amaravati. And Amaravati excludes 40,000 people. These are landless people, and when the city was planned, they were practically not rehabilitated. So children discussed it and said, no, this is not the capital we want. We want a capital that is inclusive. We want a capital that has place for everyone, especially the working classes. It is the working classes who sustain the cities. It is the working classes that build cities. It is the working classes that make the lives of the middle class and the upper classes easy, comfortable, at an extremely subsidized price. So children presented this to the minister concerned, to the chief secretary, to the others, and said, we want, if this capital is to be built, and of course there is a new government and a new plan as far as the capital is concerned, construction of the capital is concerned. In fact, one of the reports that the World Bank had considered when they evaluated, because the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank were financing the new capital, the construction of Amaravati. Both these funding organizations withdrew. And one of the things that they had considered is the children's demand, that we want a capital that includes the working classes. And these children came from the slums. The Vijayawada and Hyderabad City Children's Parliaments are from the slums. So in other words, the impact that children and children's parliament can have on the larger reality. I'm saying that the children's demand, the memorandum that the children submitted, and we had also taken a video documentary on how people have been excluded. Both these were on record in the World Bank evaluation of whether they should finance the new capital or not. And these two were considered. So in other words, the impact that children can have and children's parliaments can have. This is one example. There are many other examples that I could give on how children, through the Children's Parliament in Hyderabad, in Vijayawada, in Maharashtra, it was just taking shape when the COVID lockdown happened. So we were not able to go too far but over the years it has had tremendous impact. Now I would like to talk specifically on SDG 8. SDG 8 talks about promoting sustainable, inclusive economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. This is what SDG 8 talks about. In other words, it talks about growth, development that is inclusive. It talks about not half employment as many of our workers are condemned to, but full and productive employment. In other words, a worker has the possibility of working with his full energy and in a most productive manner, and that every worker has the possibility of working in an environment that is decent. That is what we can call worker friendly. Now, if you look at India and these SDGs, we have a workforce of 510 million. In other words, out of the 1,130 or so million population, 510 million people are working. Out of these, 94% of the workers are in what you call in the unorganized sector. They are not organized. In other words, the government sector, those working in the government sector are organized. Those working in the industries are organized. Those working in other, say whether it is shipping, transport, whichever, there is a great deal of organization that is there. But that is only 6% of our working population who have all the privileges, rights that are protected. In fact, we'll talk about that, how that is becoming also a question mark. There are 12.8 million who enter the job market every year. Young people entering the job market every year is 12.8 million. And more than 10 million children are engaged in work today. In other words, when we talk about the labor, child labor, it is as many as 10 million children who are compelled to work. The total unemployment rate in India is 6.9, which has worsened with the COVID-19. We have 20.7% children, 20.7% of the children of the 10 million children are employed in extremely hazardous work. Out of the 172 million people who are unemployed today in India, 71 million are young people, youth, who are just coming out of their universities. The government of India has introduced certain flagship programs to skill India, to skill the youth. It's one of it called the National Skill Development Mission. There is the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Antyodaya Yojana. There is the Atal Innovation Mission, and there is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme that guarantees 100 days of work for anyone who seeks work in the rural areas. There is a demand that this is extended to the urban areas today because of the great impact that unemployment in the COVID times is having on the ordinary people. Now, if you look at what are the targets that SDGs have set when we talk in terms of what is to be achieved by 2030. The first thing is that there has to be a 7% GDP growth, that every country, especially the poorest countries, countries that are still developing, achieve a 7% GDP growth. Last year, India's GDP growth was 5.02%. And this year, we know that it has gone to minus. In other words, there is a negative GDP growth as far as India is concerned. And this is something that is not just the COVID is responsible for it. There seems to be a gradual decline in growth in the country over the last few years. So this is something that is of grave concern. And what is even more concern is that women are a lot more educated today, should be in the workplaces, but there is a very rapid decline in the employment of women. Now, these obviously impact children, has very adverse impact on children. When their parents are not working, there is a very grave adverse impact that can have on children. And this is something that is of a very grave concern. Higher levels of economic productivity is another target that is set, which goes along with full and productive employment. Because see, there's a very large percentage of our workforce do not have enough work. See, for instance, the whole agricultural sector, in fact, practically almost 60% of our workers are in the agricultural sector, and they are not productively employed. In other words, the human resources that are in this country, that is the wealth of this country, is wasted away. This is something that is of a very grave concern. Productive employment of youth is another target. But as I said, we have 71 million youth that are not productively employed today. The target, the SDG target of eradicating forced labor and human trafficking. Now we know, especially during the COVID times, the human trafficking has increased manyfold. Especially very young children are being trafficked. Another is protection of labor rights. Protection of labor rights in the country is something that has come to be very controversial, workers and workers' unions have been extremely concerned. In fact, on 26th, we had a national strike in which we are told that 1.25 crore workers participated all over the country. And what were they talking about? In other words, when we have the SDG goals, we have the targets that are set, and these targets are specifically being compromised. And one of the major examples of the compromise of workers' rights and their right to decent work is the 44 labor laws. Since the 1920s, workers have agitated for better working conditions, for being able to unionize themselves, to get a minimum wage, to be able to work for 8 hours, and so that they can have leisure and time with their families, safety at workplaces. See, a number of labor laws had been passed by both before we received independence, before India became free, and after India, and particularly after India became free. 44 labor laws. These 44 labor laws have been put into what you call 4 labor codes. That has practically taken away, it has been critiqued by everyone. People like us who are in the trade union movement have been fighting over this ever since 2015, since the announcement of the labor codes was made. And finally, the last session of the parliament passed 3 of these labor codes without debate in the parliament, without the opposition being present, without sufficient, along with the farm, the 3 laws concerning farmers, and the farmers are still agitating. They are in Delhi. The large number of farmers who wanted to enter Delhi to protest against the laws that were passed that concerns the farming classes. I had 10, 12 of the farmers who had gone to Delhi staying with us last night, and they were telling about the horrid stories of how they were not allowed into the capital to protest against these laws that have been passed. So in other words, protection of labor laws that ensures basic rights have come to be compromised. And this is of a very, very major concern. And we never knew, the country practically never took note of migrant workers. In fact, the economies of our cities today are so dependent on workers who are migrants. Until we didn't notice them, until they started in millions marching back to their villages to escape hunger, to escape the fact of being unemployed, and we know how many were killed on the railway tracks, in transit, other places we have. So now this is a very grave situation. Now these migrant workers are beginning to return back, to their workplaces. I've been told there are special trains that are bringing back workers. There are buses that are being sent by employers to very remote villages in Jharkhand and Orissa and other states where a number of these workers come from. Buses are being sent, they are being transported, they are even being given flights back to their workplaces. So this is something that is happening. But in this context, see, now this gives us a context. The crisis in work, the crisis of the migrant workers, hunger that people experienced, unemployment that people experienced. Now we work with the domestic workers. Many of the employers were not allowing domestic workers to enter their families to work, which means they were not able to earn their wages, and so which means they were not able to pay their rents, and so many of them were thrown out by the landlords from their family, from their houses. In other words, this was a time of acute experience of how little SDG 8 is being recognized, is being realized. Now in this context, I think it is important to look at what is development. The SDG 8 talks about growth, sustainable growth, that is sustainable, inclusive, sustainable growth, economic growth it talks about. But is economic growth the only aim of development? Will economic growth make life comfortable, happy? What we are seeing is it does not. We are told that the major corporate companies in India have grown by huge percentages during this time of the COVID. Even as everyone lost their jobs, we are told that the Ambanis, the Adanis, and others made a lot more profit during the time of COVID than perhaps any other time. So, does economic growth protect the rights of people? It doesn't seem to. This is also the experience of many other countries. Now, it is in this context, I think we need to revisit a very eminent economist from India who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1998, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen has a very classical book called Development as Freedom. I think it is important to relook, especially when we are working with children in the context of SDG 8. I think it is important to teach our children, to teach our children's parliaments what true development means, what true development is. Now, he talks about development as a process of expanding freedoms. Expanding freedoms that help people enjoy social and economic arrangements that creates a society that is holistic, that is happy, that is mutually concerned. He talks about freedom in the context of political and civil rights. I think it is important to look at these. In other words, development is an integrated process of substantive freedoms, achieving substantive freedoms. Development is achieving political freedom. That's a basic freedom. And freedom that ensures quality of life. But if you look at quality of life, if you look at political freedoms, now we have been hearing about a number of people being in the jails in this country and increasing number of people being arrested. Young people, young students being arrested under the UAPA regime. The case of Father Stan Swami, who is 83-year-old, who has been fighting for the rights of the tribals in Jharkhand and neighboring states. He is a typical case of people taking stand on behalf of the poor, the most vulnerable people in this country are not tolerated. There are others who are in the jail in different states. I'm giving you this as one example of how unfree our people are and people who stand by people are in terms of political freedom. I think it is important that we teach our children to develop a certain critical consciousness. The landmark document of our citizenship is the Constitution of India. We need to teach our children the freedoms that the Constitution of India gives us, also the responsibilities that the Constitution of India provides us. This is something I think very, very important. In fact, our educational system has failed. Many of you are teachers. Our educational system seems to have failed us in terms of cultivating, developing a critical consciousness among children and among our youth. This is something I think that is very, very important. When we talk of development as freedom, it is political freedom on the one hand, it is freedom in terms of the quality of life of our people. I was just looking at the India's rank when we talk of quality of life. In terms of the SDGs being realized in India, India ranks 117th out of 193. In terms of the Human Development Index, India is 102 out of 117. In other words, the quality of life in India is extremely, extremely poor, and many of those children that we work with are victims of such low, extremely low quality of life. Extremely, India ranks among, if we look at those quality of life indexes, whether it is poverty, whether it is hunger, India is among the lowest ranked countries. So this is something, I think when we talk of SDG 8, inclusive, sustainable growth and development, I think this is something that we need to take care of. There is also, Amartya Sen talks about transactional freedom. Transactional freedom, economic freedom. The freedom for everyone to work, everyone to market, and everyone to live a profitably productive work environment. This is something again that has come to be compromised. I think with the globalization in 1990 and after that, one of the things that happened is monopolization. The small merchants The small traders are gradually being pushed out of possibility of marketing their products. The small is being taken over by the big. And unfortunately, I consider it quite unfortunate that we ourselves, many of us, often do our marketing in the malls. Well, whether Ambani or Adani or whichever, they can live even if their goods are not sold. But a vegetable vendor, a small vegetable farmer, a milkman, these are people who have to live with the profit that they can get from their very small products, very small quantity of products. Now, I think one of the things that we need to teach our children in our children's parliament is to promote the small vendors, the small people, because they are practically going out, their livelihoods are being increasingly affected. I think we need to relook at where we shop, where we buy our things, whom do we buy our things from. Maybe it may be comfortable to do it in an air-conditioned mall or mart or whatever, but then how that impacts the small person. This is something I think we need to relook at. So transactional freedom, that is the right of everyone, and this is something that is important. Amartya Sen also talks about organizational values that are extremely important. That when we talk about development, things like having civic institutions that protect democratic rights, and one of the great achievements of India is building strong democratic institutions over a period of time. I think our constituent fathers and mothers of our constitution, and they created very strong constitutional bodies. Today, I am afraid these have come to be compromised. Whether it is the judiciary, we are hearing, whether it is the other democratic institutions, these are being compromised. I think it's important to teach children in our children's parliaments, through our children's parliaments, as an alternative way of doing things. No, this is something that is not acceptable. What is it that we can? One is to critically look at these institutions critically. The other is that we are able to, through the neighborhood community network experience, we are able to create alternative institutions that really protect the freedoms that we are talking about. Political parties have come to be extremely corrupt. In fact, freedom from corruption is a very significant indicator of freedom. But this is what is again being compromised, and our political parties that should be in the forefront of protecting the freedoms and rights of our citizenship, our society, has come to be compromised to a great extent. We know what is happening during the elections. Educational arrangements. Now, one thing, a grave disparity that came to be that we saw during this period of the COVID, the pandemic, is that there are the middle class children, the schools where middle class children study, the upper class children study, they have had access to education through online classes. While I work in the slums, I work in around 200 slums in Hyderabad. And one thing that we found is that our children simply did not have any type of access to educational processes, simply because they didn't have the mobile phone or laptop or whatever is required. In other words, and in the rural areas, it has been a lot more worse. Those who are in the rural areas know it. Connectivity. So in other words, freedom and development, when we talk of development as freedom, each of these need to be considered if we are to assess whether our freedom, our country is free or not, if development is accessible to everybody or not. Market and market-related organizations, government and local authorities, these are all, we need to have, in other words, strong organizations, institutions, and that is based on strong values if we are to say that we are experiencing development. When we talk of really realizing SDG 8, this is what it would mean. Also, institutions and institutional freedoms. In other words, as I said, freedom from corruption is something that is important. Especially also to how do we protect, how does this country protect its most vulnerable people? The old people, for instance, the Dalits, the tribals. Until there are very special instruments that are there to protect the most vulnerable people in this country, we cannot say that we are free. We cannot say that we are developed. Also, we must talk about spiritual freedom. The freedom of conscious, to choose what we want to profess, for instance. Which religion, which or no religion, what festivals we must celebrate, that dialogue and possibility of celebrating with people from different traditions together. In other words, I remember Varghese's session on spirituality that precisely talks about the possibilities of being free in how we express ourselves, even in a spiritual way. So, in other words, okay, SDG talks about inclusive, sustainable economic growth. It talks about full and productive employment. It talks about decent work for all. This can be possible only, as Amartya Sen said, we are able to experience freedom in every aspect of our lives, especially, say, for instance, women, the lack of experience of freedom that women experience to go out into the public spaces. They want the way that they want to dress, the way they want to get employment. So many constraints that happens in the process of doing these. In other words, the freedom, the development that we are talking about is larger than growth. And we need to teach our children and create institutions that will help children to experience freedom as development. So with that, I close this session on SDG 8. Maybe take a couple of minutes break. Now I will dwell a few minutes on SDG 11. SDG 11 is sustainable cities and communities. Now the challenge before us, before I go to that, just give you where India stands. In other words, India stands in terms of our urban context, because SDG 11 talks about making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. If you talk of India, by 2030 we are told that we will have 7 mega cities, that is with cities that will have a population of over 10 million people. As of now, 31 people out of 100, in other words, 31% of our population live in the urban areas. 17 out of that, 17% of the urban population live in slums. 13% of our urban households do not have sanitary toilets. These are basic things. 62 million tons per annum of waste is generated by our cities. And 1.2 million people died in 2017 because of pollution. This is just to give you the type of situation that we live in when we talk about SDG 11 and sustainable cities and communities. So the challenge before us is, as of now, more than half of humanity, that is 4.2 million people, live in cities today, the world over. And by 2030, it is estimated that 6 out of 10 people will be city dwellers. By 2030, the world is projected to have 43 megacities with more than 10 million inhabitants each. And most of these will be in the south, countries of the south. The cities occupy only 3% of the planet's land, but it consumes 60 to 80% of the energy consumption, and 75% of the planet's carbon emissions come from the cities. We had the floods in Hyderabad recently, and one of the things that came up so prominently is how the water bodies have been occupied by the builders, by the government, by others. So it is extremely important that SDGs, in other words, perhaps many of us live in the urban context. It is important to consider what is the type of cities that we want. The world is becoming increasingly urbanized. As of now, 31% of India's population live in urban areas. By 2050, we will certainly exceed 50% of the urban population living in cities. Now, in that context, it is important that cities, we must consider that cities are engines for sustainable development. In 2014, when the first UPA government, Manmohan Singh, in his one of his first speeches, said cities are our engines of growth, and the cities need to be sustained. The cities, the working class of the cities need to be sustained, and this is something that is. See, now the cities are it is where ideas, commerce, culture, science, productivity thrives. Urban spaces offer opportunities for people to prosper economically, to prosper socially. But if this can be possible only if our cities are inclusive, can accommodate people from all sections. Otherwise, we cannot talk of sustainable growth, sustainable cities. Now, if we are to address this issue of making our cities sustainable, we need to ensure that one basic requirement, the basic requirements are provided to all. The Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister Modi, announced that by 2022, everyone in this country will have a decent house. He has promised to build 20 million houses by 2022 in the urban areas. But our actual progress on the ground is very dismal. Now, this is something that is important. And something that people like us have been campaigning for is when we talk about housing, it should not be any type of housing, but housing that is adequate. In fact, after a lot of campaign in Telangana during the process of division of the two states, one of the important campaigns that we had made was that housing for the economically poor sections, the economically poor housing for the poorer sections of society has to be adequate, which means it needs to have at least 2 rooms, toilets, kitchen. In other words, a place where people can live with dignity. And the Telangana government came up with that. This is something that we have, I told you, the children in Vijayawada, the Children's Parliament in Vijayawada, when they talked about the new capital of Andhra Pradesh, precisely what they demanded was that they need to have adequate housing. Children from the slums, the parliament children who are members of the parliament from slums asking for housing that is adequate, that people can live with dignity. So also other basic amenities. In fact, some years ago we used to talk about the slums as a solution rather than as a problem. In fact, I started my PhD working on precisely on this theme of slums being a solution rather than because our villages are terribly socially discriminative. The villages, the way the villages are organized, socially organized in such a way that the most powerful people would be at the center of our villages and the Dalits and others are on the outskirts or outside the villages. This is a very unjust organizational structure that we have. While when people come to the urban areas, a lot of these caste factors seem to disappear. It is extremely, very strongly present even in the rural, even in the urban areas. We know our domestic workers are not allowed into the families of the upper caste, especially when it concerns cooking and other things. The Dalits and others, they are made to wash and all that, but then they are not allowed even to use their toilets. In other words, there is so much of discrimination that also happens in the urban areas, but then I think it is a lot more in the rural areas. Now this has to change. And if this is to change, in other words, if our cities are to become sustainable, just, inclusive, the present arrangements have to change. In fact, Habitat 3 really talked about this precise aspect of urban development, the cities of the future. Now, this is something I think that we need to, how to make our cities. There are many demands that we have been making through the Hyderabad City Children's Parliament, for instance. One of the things that the last city when the children in Hyderabad talked about SDG 11 and prepared their memorandum that was submitted to the Municipal Commissioner of Hyderabad and to the Mayor of Hyderabad. One of the demands that the children in their parliament passed and as a resolution was that 20% of the land, as of now, 20% of the land that is allotted to housing in the urban planning in the cities has to be for the working classes. People who say in a city like Hyderabad, it is around 30%, over 30% who are living in slums. We were asking for at least 20% of the land for the working classes. Similarly, water, other resources, there has to be a just and equitable distribution of these resources of the city if you are talking about, and then we need to teach our children. whether they come from the upper classes, middle classes, or to respect the domestic workers that work for their families and ask, where do they live? What do they have? We need to teach our children to tell their parents that they need to pay just wages. I know cases where a couple working earn 1 lakh, 1,50,000 rupees a month, but it is with very great difficulty that they pay even 10,000 rupees for their domestic worker. No, we have a middle class culture that would go into a clothes shop, buy a sari that is worth 15 or 20,000 rupees, which they may wear or may not wear, but the very same people will with a great difficulty pay their domestic worker, pay their driver, pay their other staff who support their life. Now, these type of arrangements need to change. We need, one of the roles and responsibilities of our Children's Parliament is to precisely create the neighborhoods where such rights of people are protected. One of the things that Hyderabad had those recent floods, Chennai experienced floods a few years ago, and now this is something that will continuously happen. Now, how do we, a very big challenge that has arisen in the context of the floods in Hyderabad is, how do we protect our water bodies? This is something that is extremely important because, say, a city like Hyderabad has so many water bodies that have been occupied, and that is precisely that caused the floods that happened. Similarly, other cities. In other words, public spaces are being privatized by the government itself. The government is occupying water bodies and other public spaces. The corporates are occupying it. The big builders are occupying it, and also a very small percentage of the poor also occupying with their huts, because the government does not give them land to put up their house. So now this is something that has to change. Our children's parliaments need to make demands on the government, and they need to resolve among themselves that they will be able to protect public spaces, that, in other words, never allow commons that should be open to everybody to be privatized. Allow no one to occupy these. And if that is to happen, in fact, one of the demands that we wrote in a memorandum that we submitted to the Chief Secretary of Telangana recently is the government itself needs to demolish what they have occupied. They have built a bus stand in Hyderabad on Musi River. They have built the metro stations on Musi River and other water bodies. Now, if the government itself that is supposed to protect the commons does this, then what happens to the whole goal of SDG 11 to create our cities sustainable, to make our cities inclusive, make our cities that is just. So I think the children's parliaments have an extremely important role to play in their neighborhoods, yes, but also at the city level, at the state level, at the national level. And I gave you the example of what the Children's Parliament in Vijayawada, the City Children's Parliament in Vijayawada did some years ago, asking that the new capital that is being built for the state is inclusive, that their parents will also have a place in that city that is being built. And the World Bank, when it evaluated and considered whether they should continue to finance the building of Amaravati, one of the things that they had considered was this resolutions submitted to the government of Andhra Pradesh by Children's Parliament, the Vijayawada City Children's Parliaments, among other documents that were considered. So I think from my own personal experience, children are a powerhouse that can change our situations, that can create a new future for our working classes, as SDG 8 talks about, and for our cities, as SDGs 11 talks about. So thank you very much. I close these few points with that. Yeah, if there are any interactions, any questions that you would like to ask.